Welcome to this week's Property Insider video. Today, Dr. Andrew Wilson and I discuss the latest unemployment figures, how Australia is coping with lockdown, what it means to our property markets, and then we look forward close to 40 years when we look at the Intergenerational Report, and there are some astounding figures, and we look at the implications of those for our property market. So, if you'd like to keep up to date with what's happening in our property markets, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the little bell icon so you can be informed each time a new show comes out. At a time when close to 12 million Australians are in lockdown, thinking 40 hours ahead is sometimes a challenge. Now try thinking 40 years ahead. Well, that's what the federal government's done in its recently released 5th Intergenerational Report. It's taken a 40 view on where we're going to be in 2061, and it's forecast that Australia is going to be older, smaller, and more in debt than previous intergenerational reports suggested. So what does this mean for our economy? What does it mean for our property markets? There's some of the questions I'm going to be asking Dr. Andrew Wilson today, Chief Economist of My Housing Market and Australia's leading economist. And we're also going to talk about how Australia's property markets are coping with the lockdowns, what's happening to the latest unemployment figures, what's happening to the latest sales figures, and much more in property. Hi, Andrew.
Yes, good morning, Michael. And it'd be nice to be able to look ahead 40 years and be able to see what's happening, but fingers crossed that happens.
Well, we know that the forecasts made a year ago, even 6 months ago, aren't really that accurate, are they?
Yeah, that's right. I'm just saying it's very heroic to look forward 40 years. And I think that's the whole point. Who cares in 40 years' time what someone said 40 years ago, whether they're right or wrong? And of course, this thing gets updated all the time. And we only have to look back even over the last year, as you said, last 2 years, the last decade, to see all those events that have come out of left field that we could never have predicted, such as the GFC, the mining boom, the impact of low interest rates not firing up economies as they used to, and of course, unfortunately, COVID as well. Anyway, I guess it has some value to some people somewhere, Michael, I suppose. So,
Well, we've been around in the industry for over 40 years, so it's interesting to see how things have changed and how every year there's an X factor or a black swan event, and it does make all those best forecasts and all the hard work that the economists do go to waste. We'll have a bit of a talk about that, but I'd like to start off with what happened over the weekend with the auction markets, considering that the two big auction capital cities were in lockdown, Andrew.
Another remarkable weekend, Michael. Really, auction markets are taking the shutdown environment in their stride, as they have done over the last month in Sydney. We had another big weekend in auctions. The national auction numbers broke another record for July. It was the biggest number of auctions that have been conducted on a July Saturday on record, and followed the previous weekend, which was the previous record. So we've certainly got a lot of activity in our markets, and it's not just sellers getting into the market in record numbers. We're also seeing clearance rates still at high levels, very much in favour of sellers, and that means we're getting record numbers of July sales as well. Shutdown hasn't had a material impact or significant impact on the Melbourne and Sydney auction markets. The numbers bounced back in both Melbourne and Sydney at the weekend. Clearance rates were higher in Sydney, just under 80%, a little lower in Melbourne, but of course that was the first full weekend of shutdown. We just deal quickly with the smaller capitals. They were also quite strong. Brisbane's now heading into its second half of the year market, which we always discuss, Michael, is the strongest part of the year for the Brisbane housing market. We had some big numbers in Brisbane, well over 100 auctions. And we know that the next 4 or 5 months in Brisbane will be very strong. There are some individual factors such as migration that are really pushing demand high in Brisbane. And I would expect to see some prices growth as well as those consistent high auction clearance rates in Brisbane going forward. Similarly, in Adelaide and Canberra, they maintain their very high results. But just getting back to Sydney and Melbourne, Michael, we saw the Melbourne clearance rate dip down to the second lowest this year so far. But when we look a little deeper at the numbers, and we could say, I guess, initially that yes, record July day for auctions had supply pushing ahead of demand, therefore clearance rates fell. But when we look at the numbers more closely, we can see that the withdrawal rate in Melbourne, Michael, was at 24%, which is a very high level for Melbourne. Nowhere near, of course, getting a shutdown last year. Higher withdrawal numbers always have a downward effect on clearance rates because withdrawals are counted as part of the offering. So therefore, they do put downward pressure on clearance rates. But if we actually took the withdrawal numbers, and typically in Melbourne, they've been averaging around about 8 or 9% of reported auctions. If we use that 8 or 9% as instead of the 24%, which actually happened, we would have had a clearance rate over 80%, Michael, in Melbourne. So it was the withdrawals that pushed the headline rate down. But the underlying energy in Melbourne's housing market is still quite strong, even though it had that just above 70% clearance rate. And of course, it's the same story in Sydney. They had 22% of their reported auctions were withdrawn. And if we had taken that back to Sydney's normal rate, which is around about 10% withdrawn, again, we would have had a clearance rate over 80%. So quite remarkably, the COVID shutdowns have been more of a nuisance than having any effect on underlying buyer and demand in our housing markets generally going forward. And that's not to say as it continues, it will become more of a hindrance. But at this stage, it's really has nothing to do with the housing market, given the results going forward. Although we do have some other results we'll talk about shortly, which are indicating lower volumes generally in housing market activity. But I do think that's just coming from the constraints that are on people because of the physical restrictions, creating issues around transactions.
Well, our sense on the ground at Metropole is that the lockdowns are a nuisance. People are still keen to get on with their life. They're still keen to move, to upgrade their homes, to change their locations. And the lockdowns are a nuisance, but they're still doing whatever they can to secure those properties. But what can you see moving forward? What's happening to the number of sales? What's happening to the number of listings?
I guess we're looking to see the real impact as the shutdown environment continues. If it does, fingers crossed it doesn't, because obviously there are restrictions to the capacity of people to put their house on the market or to actually transact. And I think that the more difficulty is in putting your house on the market. Perhaps you're more motivated if you are in lockdown just to hold off. And also there are restrictions to getting agents in to inspect the property, to have that conversation, to promote their product to the vendor, and then to organise the advertising. So there are actual physical constraints regardless of the appetite for people listing their property. So yes, we will see new listings falling as the shutdown continues. It's a little different from sales because the sales environment has certainly adapted to lockdown by online auctions, negotiations online over the phone. You can still inspect a property, but it has to be a single inspection organised as an appointment. So the industry, buyers and sellers have adapted. I think the constraints are more on the seller side, the physical constraints. So I think we'll see fewer sellers in the market only because they are physically constrained. And maybe it's just become a sort of a retarding process rather than something that people will just put off. But again, this is the middle of the year, Michael. People start thinking about a spring selling campaign anyway this time of the year. I think that could also be part of the fewer listing energy. People say, well, look, let's wait till another month because typically that's what vendors do. And that gives us the activation of the spring selling season. But the latest data, Michael, and we'll talk about that, is confirming that the impact of the shutdown in Melbourne and Sydney, of course, Sydney's been in lockdown now for a month, and that's just occurred to Melbourne. But we have seen a drop in new listings this month compared to the previous month of 4.4% in Sydney. So that's down 4.4%, the new listings coming into the market. And in Melbourne, it's down 1.7%. So obviously not as much restrictions in Melbourne over the past month compared to Sydney. We all have seen fewer new sales in the market as well. That's actually down 6.2% in Melbourne and down by 1.7% in Sydney. Now, the difference in that is obviously sales do reflect negotiation activities 2, 3, 4 weeks before this data is actually produced. And of course, Melbourne was in shutdown a month ago. So I think that explains that. But interestingly enough, Michael, when we look at the other capital city markets, new listings and new sales are growing quite strongly, still growing quite strongly on a month-by-month basis in Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth. In fact, new sales in Brisbane are up 13.3% compared to the previous month. So that's what we were discussing before in terms of that second half Brisbane market. New sales recorded are up by 13%, up 10% in Adelaide and steady in Perth. Going forward, it will be interesting to see if the shutdown continues, whether the spring selling season will have its usual early revival, and hopefully we're out of this by September. But you've got to remember that those decisions, particularly those auction decisions, are made 6 weeks to 8 weeks before that. So we're really coming up to that period when sellers would be really starting to think about a spring selling campaign, and it'll be interesting to see the impact that that has on the numbers as they come.
Apart from the housing market, the rental markets are clearly going to be impacted by lockdowns, difficulty doing inspections, difficulty moving in and out. And the New South Wales Treasurer recently announced a 60-day moratorium on evictions for people who've lost at least 25% of their income. We know that New South Wales workers are going to be able to access federal government support depending upon how many hours a week they've lost. $375 a week if you've lost between 8 and 20 hours, up to $600 a week if you've lost more than 20 hours. There's also support for self-employed business people. But interestingly, the government's also encouraging landlords to offer impacted tenants relief by giving land tax relief or giving them grants of up to $1,500. This is in New South Wales, Andrew. Currently, Victoria hasn't come up with anything, but it's only pretty new into this. Let's hope we don't get to such a long lockdown that we have to do something like that in Victoria.
Yeah, I think in terms of the rental market, Michael, it's interesting. I actually think that we're going to see upward pressure on rents. We've basically got upward pressure on rents across the board now in our rental markets, exception being Melbourne and Sydney CBD unit markets. But I think what we see in terms of the supply and demand equation is that lockdown really affects the number of new properties coming into the market for rent, because people obviously moving, but we're still seeing quite reasonable demand from tenants for properties because they can still inspect, Michael. They're still allowed to move properties. And really that hasn't changed. We know that we don't have the drive from the international market or rental properties such as students. But I think the market's adapted to that. That sort of churn level sort of falls away because people don't move house during lockdown, less likely to. But that means there's much fewer vacancies. But we still have a reasonable amount of those tenants or those people looking for properties to rent. And I think that means that, if anything, we'll see upward pressure on rents as a consequence of COVID environment.
Counterintuitive, not what anyone expected.
Yes, so far that's what the data is supporting.
Yeah.
But of course, the other thing is that we're seeing a fall in first home buyer numbers. In the medium term, hopefully post-COVID, we're going to see more demand for rental properties anyway from those first home buyers that have been squeezed out of the buying market and will obviously be looking for somewhere to live, and that would be a rental property.
Well, over the last week also, Andrew, the jobless figures came out and unemployment fell to below 5%. I remember when you suggested that earlier this year. I know various people poo-pahed it, but the unemployment level fell from 5.12% to a decade low of 4.9%. But I think what was good, Andrew, was a lot of full-time jobs were created. That's good rather than part-time jobs. And the number of people employed rose to a record high in Australia, over 13 million people.
Yeah, a remarkable number, I guess, Michael, in such a short period of time. We don't want to sort of go back to the old story about those who got it wrong and how outrageous their predictions were. But I think the interesting point, there's a couple of interesting points. We still have a high participation rate. So the low unemployment rate is not a product of fewer people in the workforce. We're actually got near record levels of the participation of the population in work or looking for work. That's the perfect environment. It's bigger workforce and a lower unemployment rate. That means that we're creating enough jobs to draw people into the workforce. The fact is that we've got the lowest unemployment rate since 2010, and all of the higher interest rate spruikers who've gone a bit quiet lately. Bit of egg there again on the faces, but because COVID's not going to do anything for the economy to make us anywhere closer to higher interest rates, for goodness sake. And the Fed came out last week and absolutely slammed any suggestions of interest rates will rise higher or sooner rather than later, despite high inflation numbers out of the US. We are at the unemployment rate we were at when we last had interest rates increasing, Michael. So you can see how it's irrelevant, unfortunately, that the connection, the nexus between low unemployment and higher interest rates is just certainly not there at the moment. And we will get higher inflation as the economy adjusts out of COVID last year. But again, it's all about incomes growth, Michael. It's great inflation, but it's all about incomes growth and matching inflation. And if we don't get those two moving together, there isn't a chance in whatever of getting higher interest rates. My concern is that we will get a higher inflation, but lower wages growth, which will mean real wages are actually falling, and that will be a conundrum. But I think you look forward to the future. If you want a negative headline, there it is for you, is that higher inflation will not drive higher incomes, which means real incomes will fall, and we don't have lower interest rates to try to support real incomes falling. So that's a really big problem going forward, which may occur. And this is an early sign that we've got this very low level of unemployment. We've got a long way to go before we get to the 4% incomes growth that we had back in, remembering incomes growth is around 1.2% at the moment, back when we had a 4.9% unemployment rate. Nonetheless, I think that there are some other interesting points in terms of the unemployment numbers, Michael. Firstly, we tick every box, as you said, except one, and that is that hours worked are continuing to fall.
Yes.
So I think that shows certainly good to be in work, but I think we're seeing a lot of people are sacrificing hours worked to be in the workforce. So we're not having as many hours worked. And again, Michael, that's not good news for incomes growth, which is what we need. Obviously, if you're working fewer hours, you're earning less. And that means, again, despite low unemployment, we might not be getting that incomes growth.
I noticed that, Andrew, that hours worked are lower. I guess what that means is there's still spare capacity in the workforce before they have to raise wages to get more people in.
And wages growth is going to be the last thing employers are going to be considering. We don't have centralised wage fixing anymore. So the bargaining power of workforces is less, particularly given this on-again, off-again lockdown environment. And businesses will be very fixed on keeping their costs low. We have the internationalisation of our economy. That means there can be a lot of offshore transference of labour, which we've already seen. And the other point is there's technological change, which we've seen, in the retail sector, particularly, that is changing labour-intensive workforces into those that are more adapted to technology and digital transfer. And that, again, means that's downward pressure on wages, or certainly keeps wages flat compared to previous periods. But I think the final thing, Michael, about the unemployment rate was how well Victoria has done.
Yes.
It's Victoria now, its unemployment rate has gone from the highest to the lowest, just of all the states, and down to 4.4%. New South Wales has been stuck at 5.1% for a while now. But I think Victoria is obviously a clear beneficiary of the home builder policy. And that'll continue to keep it perhaps at the lowest of all the states in terms of unemployment. And that's good news, I guess, for Victorians who were actually at the other end of the pineapple not so long ago.
Isn't it interesting considering how many days of lockdown, weeks of lockdown we had last year? Just to finish off today, Andrew, looking at the Intergenerational Report that we started to talk about at a very high level, I was interested to see what population projections would be. In the latest report, they're suggesting our population in 40 years' time could be 38.8 million. This is down from about 40 million. It means we're growing a bit slower, but we're still going to be the fastest, or one of the fastest growing developed countries. What I found interesting was, if you think about it, it took us 200 odd years since European settlement to reach a population of 25.5 million. But in the next 40 years, our population, according to these forecasts, is going to increase 13.3 million people. In other words, increase by over 50%. Currently, there's 2.5 million people in each household. The suggestion is there's going to be a few less as households are shrinking. This is going to have a massive impact on what our property markets are going to look like. It's been suggested that for every 2 houses in Australia at the moment, we're going to need one more. We may need a third more dwellings over the next 40 years.
We're already running out of properties now. It's only the shutting of borders that's stopped what it would be a more obvious environment of home housing shortages. We have significant supply constraints. We always focus on the demand. And even though we've had a surge in fringe home building over the last 12 months as a result of Home Builder, it's done nothing for inner suburban, middle ring suburbs where most people want to live. And of course, Home Builder is finished now, and we're still 20% down on our previous dwelling peaks of approvals back in 2000. So where are we going to find them? Well, we're not going to find them, and that's going to be the big challenge going forward, Michael, and it will mean that owning a property becomes even more of a definitive part of your wealth creation environment, because owning a property is going to become that much more difficult, particularly with a shortage of of supply going forward. But just on the population expansion, I think the interesting thing here, Michael, is obviously that population growth will be driven by high levels of migration. The migration debate is now starting to heat up because we've been forced to close our borders. It would never have happened under normal circumstances. It would have been just political suicide to close our borders and stop migration. But because we've been forced to do that now, perhaps policymakers will have to look at the high migration versus no migration argument just to see whether it is nirvana for economic growth that it's purported to be, particularly in relation to incomes growth, which is the main game, as I keep saying. If we do have more people coming in, it's more competition for labour. Now it creates more demand. But let's face it, we've had no incomes growth during the strongest period of our migration in our history over the last decade. So maybe there's a cause and effect there. So my point is, Michael, that maybe we're not going to see those record levels of migration, the world's fastest or highest levels per capita of migration that we've been used to, because the economic debate will change, particularly given if we do have the spectre of, and let's hope it doesn't happen, of real wages falling in this country. And that would make it another political hot potato to sort of start opening up borders, because there's a lot that promote that, and they have a lot of grunt in terms of decision making.
The other side of the argument, of course, is that there's going to be more 65-year-olds. You and I are eventually going to get to that age too, Andrew. And what it suggests is that moving forward, we're going to need to increase migration to help support them. Currently, there are 4 workers for every person over the age of 65. By 2061, in 40 years' time, the suggestion is there's only going to be 2.5 workers, but there's going to be more older people. We're going to live longer, and so we're going to need more healthcare systems. And the interesting thing is that a lot of the baby boomers haven't got good super. We didn't have super when we first started off, so there's not a lifetime of private support to be self-funded retirees in the future, which means that we are going to have to import more skilled workers to pay taxes. That's just the other side of the argument.
Well, look, that's right, Michael, but I think the over 65s are those that have generated wealth and supported the economy, particularly through property wealth, and created the, I guess, the tax incentives for that to be a wealth creator. And also it was that generation that allowed the superannuation to become an offset to the pension. So I think that it's the over 65s that don't need to be supported to the same degree as previous generations who had to rely on the pension for income support and didn't have the property wealth that the over 65 generation clearly has. And so I think the problems still lie, if we do have real wages falling, Michael, with that younger generation. And I think that could be the issue, that actually it's not the retirees that are struggling, it's the ones that are coming through. And I think the next great debate, perhaps, that needs to be had is, do we need superannuation at all, Michael? Because given what the returns have been over the last few years, and given perhaps what the options for investment opportunities are, rather than locking your super away all your life, that maybe given an environment of low incomes growth and low wealth in I guess, recent generations, that might mean, well, what do we use super for if we're just creating a stagnant environment for our retirement? Anyway, there's some interesting questions there, Michael.
Interesting questions. Well, I look forward to seeing in 40 years' time whether those forecasts are true. I'm going to be 108 at that stage. It'll be interesting to see what it's like.
Well,
let's catch up next week.
We're still doing the videos, Michael. I'm quite
I wonder how we're going to be doing it in those days. Look forward to doing it with you again next week. Bye.
Thank you.